And
I think you have mentioned 4.
Oh, is that 4?
So
okay.
Ngugi.
So Gugwa Thiongo, Chinua Achebe, Okot Pibitek, I've said Wole Soyinka, and then I had also Christopher Okigbo, who is also a Nigerian. And the reason for Christopher Okigbo was because of his association with, I had read Chinua Achebe, and he writes very fondly of Christopher Okigbo. And I knew I needed to understand case of Okigbo, especially because when I met Chinua Achebe, this was in Cambridge, he had come to give a lecture there. He read a poem that he had a poem tribute to Christopher Okigbo, a writer who had left who had put down his pen and picked up the gun to go to fight at the front line during the Biafra War, and he fell. Where he's one of those missing in action fighters. So he died at the battlefront during the Biafra War. So, and it's the way Chinua Achebe read the poem, because at the end of every line he would go, Okigbo. And then the poem will try to ask questions. Can you hear me? Where are you? Why did you set out on this journey? Okigbo. Now, if you've heard Chinua Achebe, he had a very fatherly tone, very fatherly presence, very, very soft, soothing tone to the way he spoke. This poem was very captivating, and I thought, yeah, I want to understand Christopher Okigbo. Why would he put down his pen? An accomplished writer, the big 5, if you like, of Nigerian literary scene. You talk about Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Christopher Okigbo, J.P. Clark, and maybe 1 or 2 others. So why would he abandon writing and go to fight for his people? Why would the quest for the emancipation of his own people, the Igbos of Eastern Nigeria, why would that be bigger than his literary output or literary creativity? So here you are confronted with a sense in which you feel you don't just read literature for the sake of entertainment. You don't just come to read literature for the sake of, to pass your exams in school. Here is an engagement it's a matter of life and death. And then you began to understand people, to read accounts of Wole Soyinka, see how he has been incarcerated, exiled several times, life threatened, sometimes coming very close to, near misses death, assassination attempts, spends 22 months in solitary confinement during the, suffers under the Sani Abacha's regime, Gowon's regime, when he's incarcerated in a solitary confinement. So you begin to think literature is a matter of life and death. These people are not just writing for the sake of writing. They're writing because they believe there's a certain faith, there's a certain quest that's beyond their own comfort. They could have been happy being just lecturers in the universities. They were, after all, in one of the most prestigious universities in Nigeria, the premier university, Ibadan. They were lecturers there. They had the Mbari Club. They would have enjoyed their art, their production with their luxurious life. They didn't. They went ahead to confront life, the Nigerian scene, with their very lives. So, and then that one was quite interesting for me, because when you compared the questions that they were raising, the concerns, whether it's Wole Soyinka, whether it's Chinua Achebe, and I have summarized those concerns in thematics that I thought was identifiable in all their works. And then you come back to the African theologians, who are also raising questions about African, identity, African, emerging out of, that's a suppressed state of being, that state of dispossession, and being people who can speak their own mind, people who can represent themselves on the global stage, representatives of their own people, and how their writing was comparable to the writings of the first, second, and third perhaps 4th century Christian writers, theologians, who, and perhaps you're familiar with this phrase, their writings were, or their apologetics was about life and death, apologia pro vita sua, a matter of life and death. You could be killed. I mean, Justin Martyr is just matter because he was martyred. And other theologians, whether they were African or from elsewhere, Greek speakers, Latin speakers, and all that. So I feel here we are talking about concerns that are not just about casual matters of life. These are concerns that run deep. It's about humanity. It's against injustice, the dehumanization of people, whether it's by the colonial governments or by the regimes, the African regimes. In this case, Nigeria, because it quickly became my focus. How a life is dehumanized by fellow human beings, and how justice. For Soyinka, for example, and I have to say, I would realize very quickly that I could not focus on all the African writers. I spent the first 2-3 years reading all of them, and I realized there was just too much to take on board and to summarize into a thesis. So I decided to focus on Wole Soyinka, and of course I was warned. Wole Soyinka is a hard nut to crack. I remember a colleague of ours who is a literary person, had PhD in literature, had said to him, "Abraham, who are you? Who do you think you are? Professors in Nigeria avoid Wole Soyinka. Who do you think you are to take on Soyinka?" But the thing that lured me more and kind of convinced me I needed to stick with Soyinka was because when you read Soyinka, as hard as he is, yes, and he's very difficult, deliberately so, he justifies his complex writing. He says complex subjects elicit complex treatment. And that one for him is a way of saying, yes, so I use complex language. Even though people like, some other writers would critique him for denying us a lot of wisdom by using elliptical kind of writing style. But with Soyinka, if we may stick with him, he would say himself, and you see in his life, long before I started reading Wole Soyinka, I knew him from my childhood growing up in Kenya because he was always in the news. Wole Soyinka, people like Ken Saro-Wiwa, these were people who are always in the news. Amnesty International, Western government trying to intervene, to persuade or sometimes compel the Nigerian government, the different regimes, Sani Abacha, Yakubu Gowon, to release them or to grant them access to return back to Kenya, to Nigeria. Ken Saro-Wiwa is assassinated. People like Mashoud Biola is assassinated. Soyinka continues to fight. And he says, he would tell us, when he says this, you can see in his life and you can see in his writings, he says, I became associated with the phrase, justice is the first condition for humanity. Justice is the first condition for humanity. And you read, for instance, you read his earliest memoir. He has 5 memoirs, as far as I know. Maybe these are 6, but as far as I know, he's written 5 kind of autobiographical memoirs. The first one, based on his time in prison in solitary confinement in Nigeria, The Man Died. It's called The Man Died. Those are the opening words. Justice is the first condition of humanity. A man dies every time we choose to remain silent. So here is a man who is not just writing. Here is a man who is, I may use a theological term, incarnating his ideas in his very life. Sure. So that really drew Wole Soyinka close to me, because I felt, okay, he is a man who really believes what he's writing, and even though his writings are difficult, he seems to be speaking deeply to things that I felt I resonated with. But early on, when I sat down with Professor Bediako in his office, at the institute in Akropong, he said to me, having given me some initial writing, responses to what I was doing, he said to me categorically, the difficulty we have here, Abraham, is to make Wole Soyinka speak theology. Well, I went away thinking, oh my, what have I done? I do not understand the things he writes in English, leave alone in his literary, using his literary devices. I haven't got theater background. I haven't got the things, Yoruba background, because he's a Yoruba writer and he draws heavily from the Yoruba world of cultural world or religious world. I walk away out of Professor Bediako's office thinking, woe unto me, what have I done? So I go back to my room and I say, well, the best I can do is keep reading. If I don't know what to say, let me at least read. And I pick a book, the book that I had recently acquired. It is probably one of his more serious works, well, I say serious in terms of depth and engagement, a book called Myth, Literature, and the African World. Now, there's a story behind this book, that goes back to his early days when he returned to Nigeria in 1960. I'll tell you in a moment. But in this book, Myth, Literature, and the African World, Soyinka himself set me free. Now, I spoke about the preface. It is in the preface that Soyinka himself gave me the license to proceed to do theological critique of his work, because in the preface, Soyinka tells us categorically that this work is a response to the ideas, to the writings of his fellow Africans who had become betrayers of African cultural identity. He calls them cultural deniers. Now, for me, I nearly jumped out of, it's one of those moments you think, eureka, eureka, because the people he was talking about are none other than people that I knew very well. John Mbiti, Bolaji Idowu, Ogotomeli Kagame, Willie Abrahams, Sheikh Anta Diop. People I had already read in my theological work, whether it's in terms of theology, history, or philosophy, and understood well. He's the one. He's saying to us that this major work is a response to it's a reaction to their stance, to their intellectual scholarly stance. And I thought, I don't have to make Soyinka speak theology. He's doing it himself. Because he goes ahead to talk about Yoruba religious world, the Yoruba, the African world, as he says, but he focuses on his people, the Yoruba, but as well as West Africa, which was his context. Now, I have to say that why Myth, Literature, and the African World is a key book for me is because when Soyinka returned to Africa in 1960, having completed his studies at Leeds, having been exposed to theatre life in London, he's a playwright. He's a theatre man, having worked among some very leading, literary but also theatre personalities. He returns to Nigeria in 1960 on the eve of the Nigeria's independence, and he returns back on the wings of Rockefeller Fellowship. Now, his task, it's very well funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. In fact, it's so well funded, he has a brand new Land Rover to facilitate his research. His research is to focus on the whole of West Africa. His main agenda is to research into the festivals, traditional festivals of African people in West Africa. Now, that is in 1960. Soyinka, we know this because there's now an account that shows the case, does not produce any report from this extensive research. It's a very well-funded fellowship. We will be told later that he didn't even return the Land Rover, but it's not for me to say that. In fact, there's a small article written by James Gibbs, published in one of the books, included in, I think it's Ban Linforth, Ali Soyinka. And James Gibbs, who is a leading scholar, in African theatre, but also literature, a British scholar. In fact, he would become my examiner several years later. I didn't know, I had no clue then. James wrote this article. The title of this article is "A Jolly Bad Fellow." Mm-hmm. A jolly bad fellow. And the bad fellow is Wole Soyinka. And he says basically, Soyinka was given this money, this Land Rover, to conduct this research, but he never produced any report all these years. We know that Soyinka was writing some plays, plays like the Jero plays, and he was also doing some live productions, of plays in Nigeria, but also outside of Nigeria. But as far as this research is concerned, what you would expect would have constituted his, PhD work, as it were. There's no record of it. Well, I have argued that several years later, 1976, when he published Myth, Literature, and the African World, that is the product of that research, that extensive research. Because it is in this book where Soyinka now brings out the African festivals, the ideas of within the African festivals, African indigenous creativity, whether it's in terms of theater, whether it's in terms of religious beliefs, philosophical understanding, self-understanding. This book becomes the product of that work that was conducted 15, 16 years prior to that. So, and for me, even though I have favorite works of Soyinka, this for me is the most significant work that connects Soyinka's not only creativity, but also research work in Nigeria and West Africa. It covers the whole of West Africa. And for me, a major work such as this that is produced, I think he was based in Cambridge when he produced this work, finally. And to tell us in his own words that it's a response to those cultural deniers. Of course, in 1976, by this time, the British had started writing. The Idos were well established, in Ibadan, Mbiti in Makerere, and then subsequently Cambridge, where he would go later. And they were writing things that nobody taught them. We have to note that the Mbitis, the Idos, even though with Ido he has Parinda, who is also a contemporary teacher at Ibadan at the time. They are going beyond what they were taught. And here is Wole Soyinka. He's aware of what the theologians are saying. And he determines, no, time has come to recall my work. Time has come to now put together my thoughts. He had presented a short article at a conference in Cuba in the 60s. He was invited to Cuba. The then president of Cuba was there, opened the session. But that title, that article that Wole Soyinka presented was not, it was just an article, a 1 hour presentation, if you like. Nothing compared to the book that he would write in 1976, Myth, Literature, and the African World. So I didn't have to make Soyinka speak theology. And I realized Soyinka's core concerns resonate deeply with the concerns that African theologians had already put forward. Basically, these two camps, whether it's the theologians and the creative African writers, were engaging with the same themes, with the same concerns, call them concerns. I have subsequently argued them as thematics that constitute Wole Soyinka's writings. People will say, oh, it's very difficult to put Soyinka in boxes. Yes, of course, it's difficult, and you shouldn't put it in boxes. But to help you understand Soyinka, I have suggested 3 thematics, which I think are also, I'm convinced, identifiable in the concerns of other African writers, including theologians. So, and there are three. One of them is the advocacy of indigenous African heritage. Advocacy of indigenous African heritage. Well, why do I say that of Soyinka? His works speak for themselves. But if you are not convinced that his works speak for themselves, you really, if you argue that Soyinka's works do not speak for advocacy of African indigenous heritage, then you have not read Wole Soyinka or understood him. But if you didn't believe that, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize, the citation for the prize said, "We are awarding Wole Soyinka this prize because of his representation of African culture." So the rest of the world, if we Africans are not going to acknowledge that he was a cultural ambassador, the rest of the world, well, the highest authorities, if you like, in terms of awarding institutions, the Nobel Prize was awarded for his representation of the African culture on a global stage. Now, some people have argued, why didn't Chinua Achebe win that Nobel Prize? That's another discussion, and it's very heated discussion in Nigeria even today. You have two camps, the Soyinka and the Achebe camp, and you go back to Biafra War again in some senses. So his first thematic, when you read his plays, whether it's Madmen and Specialists, when you read his, or even the best known play, the Jero plays, there's a lot of indigenous heritage there. You see people like Amope, the petty trader woman. You see people like even Brother Jero himself. The way he invents himself, he transforms himself to survive the times. People like Chume. Chume for me is the character that really demonstrates how Soyinka's concern is to do advocacy of indigenous heritage. And it's very interesting when you read the accounts of Jero play. A lot of people don't follow these things, but his relationship with his wife, should he beat his wife or not, comes up. And then he's also learning how to play the trumpet, and he has his teacher, Major Silva, Captain Silva, actually. This is Captain Major. Anyway, he's learning how to play the trumpet. His first teacher, who understands him very well, helps him to play the trumpet in his own style. But when he travels and he has a replacement teacher, this second teacher does not understand Chume, and he wants Chume to play pure notes. So Chume plays the music, but he adds in some slurring, He wants to connect his notes, it's a trumpet after all. And the teacher said, no, stop. You cannot play like that. You have to play pure notes. And then Chume becomes angry and says, now you want me to play pure notes. Me, I don't eat san soup. How can you ask me to eat soup without flavor? You have to add salt, you have to add pepper, you have to add guang fish. So, and he starts throwing in, the condiments that Yoruba people, Nigerian people would add to the soup to make soup taste better. Sure. So you want me to play pure notes, but and it's broken English. It is pidgin. He said, "It go taste like sand. I don't take sand soup. Me, I want to put pepper inside. I want to put salt inside. I want to put guang inside. The small fish, those very flavorsome fish." So you see this a lot of advocacy there for indigenous creativity, a spontaneity that can come from an African. Now you read another play, whether it's I said Madman and Specialist, whether it is or other books, like The Interpreters. This that says, even though he would say to understand the Yoruba religion you have to understand Greek religion. Again, he comes back to the Yoruba religion. He uses the Yoruba poetry, the orikis, the indigenous categories. So you could go on and on to show that. So that's first thematic, advocacy of indigenous heritage. And that's the groundwork that I had to establish and show how that relates to what the Idos, what the Mbitis were doing, in their own space or stations. Now, the second thematic that I've suggested in my thesis is the vision of a greater humanity. The vision of a greater humanity. Again, when you read Soyinka's writings, whether it's his recent book published in 2012 of Africa, or whether it is that play Madman and Special, or whether it's another play, Death and the King's Horseman. You know, there's a certain vision that Soyinka presents in his quest for justice, in his address against the dehumanization of people. It comes out clearly that Soyinka is his vision, his dream, if you like. He doesn't call it dream. His idea is fixated on a people who are free of colonization, of course, free of regimes like the dictatorial regimes that Nigeria has suffered, free of economic injustices, free of intellectual dispossession. And he's very big on that one, especially the climate of fear of Africa, and all his works. And then he talks about the need he proposes an African spirituality as the most important African export. An African spirituality that is centered on the understanding of what constitutes a human being. So he writes a poem, for instance, Mandela's Earth, in which he presents Mandela as the image of that perfection. You know, he calls Mandela the avatar. The avatar. You know, the avatar in Hinduism is the representation of a god. It's the manifestation of a god in physical body. And to Wole Soyinka, Mandela is the avatar in that sense. And then he writes another play, again, drawing back from the South African scene, the experience with apartheid. He writes Ogun Abibiman. Ogun Abibiman is a very interesting play because it takes on, it kind of infuses, it brings Ogun, a Yoruba god, Orisha, if you like, and the South African, the Shaka spirit, the spirit of Shaka the Zulu fighter. And it brings them together. So Ogun fights with the Shaka spirit, you know, to overcome the shackles, to break the shackles, to overcome the injustices, and to free the African personality, the African people, black people, he tells us, is his constituency, wherever they are, whether they are on the continent or in Brazil or in the Americas, black people. So he invokes the spirit of Shaka and Ogunian principle to present a framework for the emancipation of a people, a vision of a greater humanity. Of course, he wants Africans to participate on the global stage as equals, you know, and I think for me, that is one, it's not an excuse, but perhaps one of the reasons why when Soyinka writes, he writes in a way as if to put him at par with Western writers, you know, with Shakespeare even, I dare say. And I say that because when I went to Nigeria to do my research, I met very helpful people, professors and scholars who really, really went out of their way to facilitate my research. One of them, the man that I met accidentally at a bookshop in Jericho, the booksellers, was the former governor of Oyo State, a certain astute man called Victor Olunloyo. Victor Olunloyo went to Oxford. He was the top student in his time. He scored the highest marks in mathematics at Oxford in those days. He comes back to Nigeria. He becomes the governor of Oyo State. And he's the one who told me when I introduced myself to him inside the bookshop. And he says, oh, WS equals William Shakespeare equals Wole Soyinka. That's how he signed one of my books. So even to the eyes of fellow very well learned Nigerians, Soyinka presented himself quite successfully as the African Shakespeare. So and perhaps in Soyinka's mind, that's why he has to write and be at par with fellow Western writers, you know, with whom he identifies deeply. He identifies not only with their styles, he identifies, for instance, Romanticism. He identifies also with their with the style, the language, the devices that he employs. And when he speaks, Soyinka, he's very accomplished. You know, he speaks very eloquently. He's urbane, he's sophisticated. He doesn't speak the way we speak, you and I, Harvey, He speaks as if English is his own language and his own slave, tool, instrument to manipulate, to use the way he likes, freely and with a lot of authority. I don't know, you probably saw during your time in Oxford, he was one of the candidates that had been shortlisted for the Oxford resident poet.
Sure.
And for a while, he was the front runner.
Sure.
Well, there were politics involved, and of course, Armitage, the current poet, was selected. Soyinka was not selected.
Sure.
That's another story. So, in a sense, Soyinka, the way he writes, he's pursuing that vision of a greater humanity, and he wants to present the African as an equal player.
Sure.
And he takes himself as the embodiment of what Africanness is, or what an African writer, an African personality is. So he's not afraid, And no wonder he wins the Nobel Prize. I think those are the features perhaps that qualifies him above someone like Chinua Achebe to win the Nobel Prize. So that's the second thematic vision of a greater humanity. If you look at the works of African theologians, the Mbitis, the Idos, they too are seeking to present the African as an equal player. He's not second-hand. He's not a servant of his Western masters, or his theology is as good and even more relevant to the African as the theologian of a German theologian would be to a European or to a German, and they can speak as true representatives of their own people. So quickly, the third thematic, and this is where the problematic is and the critique. So far, as I speak of Wole and Soyinka, and I hope I have conveyed that, I'm not coming as this Christian who is reading the works of this pagan writer and dismissing everything. No, I celebrate Wole Soyinka, and I celebrate him, and I affirm his concerns for justice. These are concerns that are biblical, that are Christian, they are prophetic. They are the concerns that we all should be, we should be activists for, whether it's in our scholarship, in our work, whatever we're doing. The third thematic, which is problematic, is because it is the thematic of transcendence. And the way I have described it is Soyinka's vision, reconstituted vision for transcendence, African transcendence. Well, I say reconstituted. Reconstituted the way you reconstitute, for example, milk, or the ingredients are there, and the ingredients are African. But what Soyinka does, which for me provides the basis for a theological critique, is that he takes out that dimension of that transcendent dimension, which is embodied by what we would know as the supreme being, God. Mm-hmm. In his case, and in the Yoruba case, the Yoruba pantheon or the Yoruba religious framework, you have the Yoruba God, and the other words that people use, whether it's Oloran or Olodumare.
Sure.
Now, to Wole Soyinka, Olodumare does not exist. Now, this is a question I have even taken up with him, and he's avoided it completely. I wrote to him, he responded twice, but on the third time, when I raised the question of Olodumare, he refused to engage. Now, Olodumare, he will tell you, oh, don't you know that Olodumare's servant rolled a big boulder rock that went down the hill and crushed Olodumare to smithereens, so that we no longer have what you call supreme being. You have small ideas, small manifestations of that, and hence the Orisha. And then he says, he focuses on Ogun, and Ogun is his icon. He was dedicated to Ogun when he was young by his grandfather. Another moving account that he tells us in Ishara, one of his third autobiography memoir. The first one is the man died. The second one is Ake, and then you have Ishara, which is a tribute to it says his father, Ese, but really it is his grandfather who shines brightly there. And then you have the fifth one is You Must Set Forth at Dawn. The fourth one is called Ibadan, and it's based on his Ibadan years when he returned having studied in Europe, based at the University of Ibadan. So that he focuses on the years, the period in Nigeria where it was described as the Penkelemes years. The Penkelemes. It was a Nigerian lingo for peculiar years. There's a lot of mess. Peculiar years, Penkelemes years. So the fourth biography is Ibadan, based on the Penkelemes years. The fifth one is a recent one. I say recent, it's more than close to 9 years, maybe 10 years now. You Must Set Forth at Dawn. It's a big one, a large volume. So Soyinka himself, in talking about the vision of the transcendence, he tells us categorically that we must no longer talk about faith. We must not talk about revelation. We have to talk about aesthetics. He said we must talk about pure knowledge, you know. So with Soyinka, he dispenses with this notion of there is a supreme being who reveals himself to us. There's this supreme being who gives us the basis of our faith. For him, it does not. That one is an African, you know. And he goes back to the Yoruba to show us why he's saying that we have to have to now pursue aesthetics, secular aesthetics to be precise. So you can still talk of Ogun as a Yoruba god, deity, Orisha, but not in a sense of therefore you have faith in Ogun. Ogun is an icon. He inspires your creativity. After all, he's a god of creativity. He's also a god of war. He's a god of metallurgy. He's also the protector of orphans and widows. A complete contradiction there. But he'll tell you, no, there's no contradiction. And he'll say, if you want to understand Ogun and what you see as condition, think about the Mobius strip. The Mobius strip is like a belt that is twisted. It's complete. You can keep going, but the twist is there, and you never come to its end or to its beginning. Well, that's his way of dodging the question, basically, because for me, and I think he needs to tell his fellow Yoruba people what he has done with Olodumare.
Sure.
Because you cannot just wish Olodumare away. And in that book I cited, Myth, Literature, and the African World, what Soyinka does that betrays his framework. It weakens his framework. When he talks about Mbiti, Ido, Ogotomel Kagame, Willie Abrahams, and the others, he goes ahead to talk about Ido's book, which is titled Olodumare, God of the Yoruba religion. And then he says, he says, this otherwise excellent book.
Okay.
That's how he describes Ido's book, Olodumare, as an excellent book. Now, a book whose title is Olodumare, how can you dismiss its main thesis and still describe it as excellent? Now, he doesn't tell us what he thinks is excellent there. He doesn't tell us whether he has read and found Ido to be wrong about the Yoruba pantheon or the Yoruba religious world. He just tells us Ido, alongside Mbiti and others, they have become cultural deniers, betrayers.
Sure.
No, so he does not sustain his own thesis against the African Christian writers. So, but he goes ahead to give us a transcendence, a reconstituted transcendence that is secular. So for Soyinka, the transcendence is secular. Aesthetics is the overarching dimension under which you must see the interconnection of things. Yeah, he does not deny that there are meeting points. He does not deny that there are crossing points, but he says aesthetics ought to be the framework,
Sure.
so that we can speak one to another as equals, so that one religion does not go out there trying to convert another, like the Christians do or the Muslims. So he says, like Ifa, a religion that is informed by Ifa. He said Ifa is very liberal. Ifa affirms everybody, and that is the example that he presents as the best example of faith that preach tolerance.
Sure.
So he speaks against faiths that preach intolerance, like Christianity particularly, which he tells us in that memoir called Ibadan, titled Ibadan. He says, I dismissed Christianity because it did not constitute any sense of well-being for me. Now, when he says Christianity does not constitute any sense of well-being for me, he speaks as a Yoruba. And with the Yoruba, as with many other Nigerians or people from the northern parts of Nigeria, Ghana, West Africa generally, they have this concept of alafia. Alafia is that complete sense of well-being. Now, when Soyinka tells us that I rejected Christianity because it did not constitute a sense of well-being to me, he said it did not give me alafia.
Sure.
It did not bring completeness, well-being to me, so I dismissed it. But he has dismissed that which he himself has desecrated,
Sure.
separated, in my opinion. So I've gone ahead in that thesis to talk about ironic potentials.
Okay.
Ironic potentials, and this is in following in the line that a writer, a scholar who was a distinguished scholar in Yoruba religion and history, J.D.Y. Peel, the late J.D.Y. Peel, had mentioned. He used that term without identifying those ironic potentials. So I've gone ahead in my thesis to identify the ironic potentials.
Sure.
For instance, identification of Ogun with Jesus. So when Soyinka says we don't need these foreign saviors, we don't need Jesus. He's a foreign savior. We have our own saviors. We have Ogun, but why not at least relate how Ogun identifies with Jesus? Because Ogun is very interesting. Ogun, he is the one who, when there's a divide, a chasm that separates the gods and humanity, it is Ogun on the side of the God who says, "I will go and provide a way to humanity." So Ogun sets out in the myth. This is the myth that the book talks about, to go and reunite the gods with humanity.
Sure.
So and on this point, Soyinka does another Mobius twist. He says, where he came and the people hailed him and they made him their king.